Good day, Pastor Will here for another exciting installment of our series, Better Know a Miracle. Today is part 19. We'll be looking at Matthew 14:22 through 26, where Jesus walks on the water. We want to remember, I know we all have different prayers, different concerns, and let's continue to pray for one another. This past week, I worked with a 76-year-old man who hasn't had electricity or water in his home for 2 years. He sleeps in his car at night because it's more comfortable, and he has a variety of illnesses for which he needs medical care. And of course, home health care won't go to see him because he doesn't have a proper home. Let's remember this man. No one deserves in their final years to be treated that way. All right, we're going to look at Matthew 14:22 through 36. Okay. We're going to begin with asking ourselves, why did Jesus walk on the water? Well, it's obvious why. He had somewhere to be, someplace to be, and where did he have to be? Now, in Mark's gospel, Mark has the story of Jesus walking on the water, and it has a different emphasis. For one thing, Peter's not in that story. For another thing, in Mark's gospel, Peter says that Jesus intends to pass by the disciples, but that's not the way the story is written. In Matthew's gospel, Matthew has an entirely different emphasis, and we're going to see what that emphasis is today. We all a lot of people like to go and be by bodies of water, a bubbling brook, be at the ocean, be on the seashore, be on the river, be by a giant body of lake. Especially people in Minnesota talk about lake country and being on all these lakes, 15,000 lakes. One of the first things people would say to me when I first moved to Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes is their motto, but they would always say, well, we have more than 10,000 lakes. We have like 15,000 lakes. And actually it's a little fewer than that, but it's certainly more than 10,000. But water can have a soothing effect on us, but water can also be a place of terror for some people. Even if you think about if you go to the beach and you're in murky water, brownish water, let's say you're on the Atlantic coast instead of on the Gulf, and even if you're like in 2 inches of water and you feel something brush by your feet, you're going to jump and, oh my God, what is it? Surely it's a shark. We have this terror of the unknown. We can't see what's beyond. Some of my terrors of the water come from my early years. One of my memories is as a child, I must have been around 4 or 5, and my brother Chad and I were out. We were bugging my dad. There was a pond or a lake behind our house. It was actually more of a lake, and there were alligators in that lake. And we would bug Dad to death every day. Show us the alligator. Show us the alligator. And Dad would go out and he would see an alligator, but we didn't see anything. To us, it was just a log or something. We couldn't see an alligator. We didn't know what an alligator looked like in the water. And Dad would say, there it is. It's right there. That's the alligator. And we never saw it. And so we kept bugging Dad to death about it all the time. And one day, Mom went away to the store or something, and Dad said, all right, you want to see an alligator? I'll show you an alligator. When I think back on this now, my dad was like 26 years old when this happened. He was just a kid himself. And he took us out, and he took us down close to the edge of the water, but not all the way to the edge of the water. I guess we were about 20, 25 feet from the edge of the water, but on a beachy area. And Dad had his rifle with him, and Dad said, all right, y'all just stand right here and don't move, and you'll see an alligator in a little while. And then Dad went up and hid behind a big tree. And so we were looking out for an alligator, looking around. We didn't see anything, but we did see like a log floating in the water, and it got closer and closer to us. And, it got our attention, but it really got our attention when this alligator, it became an alligator and started walking out of the water and coming toward us. It scared us to death, and we started screaming holy terror. Dad, of course, comes out from around the tree and starts yelling and waving his arms. The alligator turns tail and goes back into the water. But, Dad knew that the alligator would see 2 little boys, 2 little creatures on shore and think, oh, it's a free lunch today, and come out. Of course, we didn't know that. We just thought Dad was going to show us the alligator. Mom also knew what was going on. And unfortunately for Dad, Mom drove up right at the moment that alligator came out of the water. So I'm sure that didn't end well for Dad. But that, taught me a healthy respect for black water. You see a lot of black water in the South. And not to take for granted that it's safe. When I lived in Minnesota, one of the most difficult things for me to learn or get used to was that there weren't any major animals, snakes or anything, that could do me bodily harm or kill me on a daily basis. And I realized at that point how much living in the South had trained me. Always watch where you step, never put your hand where you can't see, don't just jump into the water, things like that. It was kind of liberating to live up there and not have to worry about those sort of things. And then another time in that same lake, Dad, my brothers and I, me and Chad, Chad and I kept bugging Dad to take us out in this boat. There was this little wooden John boat on the beach. It was always there, and we'd always want to go out in it. And Dad would go, no, no, no. So one day we bugged him to death about it. He said, all right, get in the boat. I'll take you out for a paddle. So Chad and I are sitting in the bow of the boat, intensely looking for alligators, looking for logs. We're not going to get tricked this time. And we didn't really notice it, but the boat was sinking in the back. That's where Dad was paddling. And as the boat went down in the back more and more, the bow rose, and we finally recognized or realized that we were higher. And we turned around to look at Dad, and Dad was chest deep in water. And we were terrified. We thought the boat was sinking, all was lost, and we were going to die for sure. Of course, the boat was sitting on the floor, on the sand. It wasn't deep there at all. And Dad tried to convince us, but no, we wouldn't hear of it. We just started screaming and panicking. We were afraid of the unknown, or even what we thought was in that water, and Dad had to pick us up and walk in the shore. We never asked to go out in the boat again. I remember my own son, Karis, my middle son. We were going to go on a Disney cruise off in the Caribbean, and Karis informed us that he would not go. He was around 5 or 6 years old, maybe 7. He said, I'm not going on a cruise, no way. He had no concept of how big a cruise ship is. And he said, I can't go because of sharks. The sharks could attack the boat could sink, and we'd all be eaten by sharks. And no matter how I tried to reason with him that was not going to happen, he wouldn't listen. And so I finally decided to communicate on his own level. And I said, well, your granddad, your pop, my dad, he's really good with sharks. And when I was a child, in fact, I saw him wrestle alligators and he'd win. And so I know he can handle a shark. And so why don't we ask him if he'll take care of the shark problem? Then you can go on the cruise. And so Kara said, okay, if Pop gets rid of all the sharks on the route of our cruise ship, then I'll go. And so my dad just told Karis that he got rid of all the sharks. He made an agreement with the sharks, actually, because Dad said he spoke shark language. And all the sharks agreed to vacate the Caribbean for the entirety of our cruise and go hunt elsewhere and then come back. And Karis said, okay, I'll go on the cruise. And he did. But we all have these fears of the sea or of the water or of anything that represents chaos for us. Now, in the Matthew text, for the first time, Jesus sends his disciples ahead of him without him. He says, y'all go on, get in the boat, and go across the lake. And they do. Now, the story previous to this one was when Jesus said, okay, Jesus gets in the boat first and says, come follow me. And they follow him. And they follow him, and he goes to the other side, and he performs some miracles, and he feeds a multitude of people. And then after that, after this miraculous feeding of thousands of people with nothing, he says, all right, I'm tired. I need to recuperate. I'm going to go into the hills and pray, and y'all go ahead and take off without me, and I'll meet up with you. And so that's what he does. And I think it's important to note here that, Jesus took the time to take care of himself. Serving people takes a lot out of people. And serving others requires a lot of self-care. We need to take time for ourselves. I know a lot of pastors who don't do that well. They serve all the time, and they don't take time for themselves. I used to be that way, and I regret it. It was a terrible waste of time to work all the time. There's nothing, people may go, oh, that's wonderful. I know I've heard churches say of pastors who've died while actually preaching. They had a heart attack and died. Oh, what a wonderful man. He gave his life. He died in the pulpit. Well, that's horrible. That's just horrible. Awful. God gives us a life to enjoy. and not just to work all the time, even if it is serving others. And so anyway, Jesus, he realizes he needs some time to take care of himself, and he goes off to pray and to communicate with God. And this is the first time in the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus prays, that we see Jesus pray. Now, earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, in Matthew 6, he's asked by his disciples, how do we pray? And he tells them how to pray. And we have then the example of the Lord's Prayer, we call it. But this is the first time we actually see him doing this. And it's a part of his self-care, communicating with God. So the disciples get in the boat, as Jesus said, and they head across the lake. And while they're out on the lake, they call it the sea, we're told that a mighty tempest arises, a mighty storm, and they're battered and harassed by the waves. That's what the text actually says. They're harassed by the waves or tortured by the waves. And in the Bible, I may have mentioned it last time or before, the sea represents chaos, and it's always a threatening place. And just to get in the boat and go on the sea is to take a risk. And so being on the sea is a threat itself. And so in this text and in other sea texts, it represents, being on the sea represents all of our anxieties and the darkness and what's in the darkness that we fear. Like when a piece of seaweed brushes against you and you know it's the shark coming to eat you. And so the sea represents a barrier that separates the disciples from God, that place of chaos where nothing can be controlled and where you don't know what's going to happen and where you're in fear for your life. Place of chaos. We've been in a place of chaos in the past year and a half with the plague we've been enduring. We don't know what's going to happen and we can't control it. And we may feel abandoned by God and separated from God. And so Jesus has promised in the Gospel of Matthew to always be with us. But here we see that he's not with us, because the disciples in that boat represent the community of Christ, represent the church. And the church is off on its mission that Jesus has commanded of them. But where's Jesus? He's not there. And yet, Matthew writes in the fourth watch, that's usually from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., the darkest part of the night, Jesus comes to them in their terror and their chaos on that thrashing, torturous sea. And with Jesus and with the presence of Jesus comes the power to overcome chaos on behalf of his beloved friends, his beloved disciples. The waves are harassing, battering, torturing his disciples. And Jesus comes in that moment to be with them. Now in the Older Testament, in the Bible, you can look in Job and the Psalms, Isaiah and other places. We see examples. We see that God walks on the sea. And we learn that only God is able to walk on the sea. So there are some who say when Jesus walks on the sea and meets his friends out there in the storm, that he's revealing who he is. And I agree with that. I think Jesus is revealing who he is. But there's a difference on, well, who is he revealing himself to be? Some people think, if we look at the Old Testament text and we see that only God can walk on water, that Jesus is revealing himself to be God. Well, okay, some people go with that. All right, that's fine. That's up to you. That's up to different people. Or another way of looking at it, and looking at it from Matthew's perspective, because Matthew's perspective is very different from our perspective in the modern world. A lot's happened in interpretation in the last 2,000 years. Is Matthew saying that Jesus' ability to walk on the water is indicative of God's empowering him? Is that what it means? And there's something to strengthen that, because Peter is also able to walk on the water, empowered by Jesus. And then you could go say, well, Jesus is God. It's all a big tricky thing. Does it really matter? In Matthew's gospel, it was important to realize that Jesus was fully human, just like Peter was fully human. That doesn't mean that Jesus isn't fully divine, but that is a more modern understanding of Jesus. We have to be careful that we don't project on Matthew's gospel an understanding that was foreign to him. Why was Jesus walking on the water? When I moved up to Minnesota and I applied for a job, a position as a pastor with a denomination, with one of the denominational in the advertisement for this denomination, they said, "Can you walk on water?" And I think I used an example about I can hover over water if I'm in a hovercraft or what are those things we use? Those big fan boats we drive around in. It slipped my mind. And of course, that didn't go over well. And this guy liked to brag and say, "We're Minnesotans. We can walk on water in the winter when the lake freezes and you can walk on the lake on the ice." And that was kind of a fun thing to brag about for those Minnesotans. But Jesus doesn't walk on the water to brag. And he doesn't walk on the water to show off who he is. He walks on the water to rescue his disciples, who he loves. Matthew emphasizes Jesus' function, what he does, rather than his nature, who he is. As the Messiah, Jesus is the one charged and empowered by God to care for God's people. And that is no less true today. And Jesus empowers Peter to be able to function in that way as far as walking on the water. And Jesus empowers his disciples, those who follow him, to do the things Jesus does, to feed the hungry, to heal the sick, to love your enemies, to trust God. And we see here that Jesus is present with the community in its mission. In verse 33, Matthew writes, "those in the boat," rather than the disciples. Why would Matthew choose to use the term "those in the boat," not just say the disciples? He uses disciples in the previous story, when Jesus calmed the sea. Because Matthew is telling us that those in the boat are the followers of Jesus who are being threatened. And followers of Jesus are disciples, and disciples are followers of Jesus. There's no distinction. There's no 12 disciples and then lesser people. All of us who follow Jesus are in the boat, in the community of Christ. And then we see Peter says, "I want to get out of the boat. I want to walk to you, Jesus. I want to be like you." And Peter gets out of the boat. And his getting out of the boat, Matthew isn't telling us that Peter got out of the boat because it's about Peter. Peter represents all the disciples of Jesus, all those who follow Jesus and say we'll follow him to the ends of the earth, and how our faith works. Matthew and Peter is portraying for us the theological meaning of discipleship. Now, Peter addresses Jesus as Lord. This is what a believer would say to Jesus in Matthew's gospel: Lord and Savior. And we see that Peter has the right title for Jesus, and he shows great personal faith, but he leaves the boat in the community to do it. Think about how many people you know who do that, or maybe yourself, or I've done it. Leave the boat, leave the community, leave the other believers behind in my quest for my own personal relationship with Jesus. We tend to look at Peter's getting out of the boat as a sign of faith, but is it? Or is it more a sign of selfishness? Peter sees after he's out of the boat and he's walking on the water, his focus changes from Jesus and instead sees the threat of the chaos of the sea. And when he sees the violence of the storm, he begins to sink. And I think about all the people I've met over the years who are angry with God because of the evil in the world, or they're angry with God because of the violence in the world, and things haven't changed, and God hasn't moved in and changed all this and made it better. But God has given us the means to do so, has given his followers the means to do so. We just don't do it. But the reason we become disgruntled with God or say God doesn't exist is because we demand that proof. And when it doesn't come to our liking, Peter got out of the boat to demand that proof. And when it isn't to our liking, we give up. Peter took his focus off of Jesus, and we do the same thing. We take our focus off of Jesus, and then we see the chaos of the world, and we blame Jesus for not being who we want him to be. Peter's problem isn't just taking his eyes off of Jesus. Peter's problem is that he wanted proof of the presence of Christ. And so he left the boat in the first place. We tend to want some kind of spectacular proof that Jesus is present. I hear this all the time as a pastor. This just wonderful proof, as if the world and the way it is made is not spectacular enough. We tend to want some kind of, like Peter, we put Jesus or God to the test. You know, the demons put Jesus to the test, and just as the demons put Jesus to the test, Jesus responds to Peter the same way he responds to the demons in chapter 8 and says, come. And that's the same expression he used when Peter says, I want to get out of the boat and walk to you. Jesus says, come. What Peter is suggesting is demonic. He's not really doing it for any good purpose other than to test God. It's not Peter's lack of faith that causes him to sink. It's not the idea that if we had enough faith, or if he had enough faith, he could walk on water. It's not if we have enough faith, we can overcome all of our problems in spectacular ways. If we had enough faith, our church would grow. If we had enough faith, my mom wouldn't get cancer. If I had enough faith, I wouldn't be bankrupt. You know, those sorts of things. Faith is not to be identified with spectacular things. We're in error about that. We want these mountaintop experiences, but that doesn't mean we're going to meet God. You can have a mountaintop experience at a concert. The reality of life is that all of us will succumb to the misfortunes of life. We will have accidents. We will have disease. We will get old and have infirmities of aging. Circumstance will not be in our favor at times. And when we begin to sink, we're going to be tempted to say, oh, I didn't have enough faith. And that's just wrong. The miracle of this story is not that Peter sank in the water or got out of the boat or tried. And the miracle is not even that Jesus walked on the water. The miracle of the story is that Jesus was present in their terror and loved them. He came to them in their chaos. He didn't leave them. He kept his promise. That promise is no less true today. Jesus is still with us, still present. We need not feel guilty by any lack of faith we think we lack, but to feel overjoyed and at least comforted because God is with us in our suffering, in our fears. God is still with us. In the story, Jesus says to Peter, and remember, Peter represents all the disciples, all the followers of Jesus, past, present, future. Us, me, you. He says, oh, you of little faith. And we tend to see this as just a cut down, as Jesus, what's the word? Berating Peter. And I guess in some ways it is. Oh, you of little faith. Where's your faith, Peter? Don't you trust God to take care of you? But I think it's also a term of endearment because Jesus only uses this term with his disciples, with people who follow him. Oh, you of little faith. I think it's also a term of endearment for Jesus. You know, I have little dogs and I love them. And some people don't understand it, but that's all right. It doesn't matter. They give me a lot of joy and a lot of comfort. And sometimes they're just little stinkers. And I'll say, oh, you stinkers. But they don't really stink. They're not bad at all. It's just a term of endearment. Peter's problem is his vacillation, his vacillation, rather, is what I meant to say. His focus changing from one thing to another. First he's focused on Jesus, then he's focused on the storm. Jesus, storm, Jesus, storm. And we do that too. We focus on Jesus and think we're doing really well. Then we become insecure about something and we focus on something else. Oh, God will always be with us and we'll be okay. But that's not enough to stop, to build my portfolio or to stop my enemies from overseas from coming and killing me. So I'm going to put my faith into my government. You know, things like that, back and forth, back and forth. Little faith is better than no faith. Little faith is the reality in which we tend to live. Now, the theologian Douglas Hare says that little faith is like a song that disappears when we stop singing. Those of little faith are warned that they must exercise their little faith, or it will wither away like an unused muscle. It will. Use it or lose it. Be appreciative of your little faith. Just a little faith is all it takes. Just a little. And the feeding of the 5,000, the disciple who came to Jesus said, well, I don't know what to do. There's a guy with a few loaves and fishes. I don't know what you can do with that. It was just a little faith. And Jesus did a miraculous thing with it. Here at Madrid United Methodist Church, there's a need, somebody said, we need to feed people. There are people who are hungry, but we're just a congregation of about 7 people. What can we do? And then we serve 35,000 meals. A little faith. Don't fret over having little faith. In Matthew, I've just said that, little faith is often enough because Jesus will take care of the rest. It seems that today, we tend to look at focusing on Jesus. We tend to focus on Jesus more in the worst conditions. When all else fails, we'll start saying, oh, God, help me. When all else fails, we lose our focus on Jesus in the best conditions, when our bank accounts are full and our bellies are full. We're surrounded by friends and family and everyone's healthy. We lose focus on Jesus then. We think we deserve that way of living. We think we've been blessed by God, perhaps, in that way of living. We're convinced that when things are good, God is blessing us. But these stories, these Matthew stories, these gospel stories, illustrate that following Jesus can guarantee you 2 things. 1, God is always with you, and 2, things are not always going to go well. To believe in Jesus is to take risks. Just to get in the boat was a risk for the disciples. To get in the boat without Jesus was a risk. To take on the mission of Jesus was a risk. We'll risk the stock market, or we'll risk playing the lottery. We'll risk not wearing our seatbelts. We'll risk not getting vaccinated. We'll risk not wearing a mask. But we won't risk loving our enemies. We won't risk trusting God to take care of us by engaging in his mission, his radical mission that he calls us to love the world. And yet we expect Jesus to be with us when we're not engaged in the mission. Peter had a little faith, and he lost focus for a bit, and he screams out, "Save me!" Jesus saves him. Jesus doesn't say, nanny, nanny, boo-boo. Jesus doesn't say, oh, you blew it, buddy, bye. He saves him, puts him in the boat, says, come on, man. It's all right. And then in Matthew's story, unlike Mark's story of this story, Mark's version, in Matthew's version, the disciples worship Jesus. Of course, that's the only proper response, both as individuals and as the church, when we realize that Jesus is with us in the midst of chaos and in the midst of our mission. We realize the only proper response is to worship Jesus. Now, another thing I want to point out, and then I'll shut up. This story parallels, it may be a post-resurrection story as well, because it parallels the disciples encountering Jesus after he rose from the dead. It's early in the morning when they're in the midst of chaos out on the sea, and Jesus shows up early in the morning, just like the disciples went to the tomb and found it empty, and then they don't recognize Jesus at first, just like in the boat when they see Jesus walking. They're like, oh my God, it's a ghost. Oh, who is that? We're dead for sure. And they don't recognize Jesus early in the morning. And then Jesus identifies himself. It is I. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. It is I. It is me. I love you, remember? And then Peter gets out of the boat to go to Jesus, just like at the empty tomb. It's Peter who runs ahead to go to Jesus. And then the doubting Jesus, Peter doubting Jesus, just like at the tomb, the doubting that he really had arisen. And again, we see Peter representing all disciples, all believers, because this is how we are. This is how people are. And it's okay. It's all right. Because God's not going to give up on you. God's still going to be with you. God's going to still be reaching out and saying, it's okay, buddy. You got a little faith, but it's all right. I'm here. I can cover the rest. And then in verses 34 through 36 of this chapter, we see Jesus and the disciples get to the other side of the lake. And Jesus continues his work by healing the people who come to him and who he encounters and he goes to, who are ill or sick or maimed or blind or whatever. And so we see that this little pericope starts with Jesus feeding thousands and it ends with Jesus healing many. And this is the mission of the church. The church can't save people. Jesus can save people. That's what he does. But the church has been charged with Jesus' mission. Feed people, care for people, love people, heal people. That this nation does not have universal health care is a tremendous sin and crime of tremendous proportions. The church needs to be kicking and screaming and pitching a tantrum or do whatever it takes to change this. So that the fellow I just mentioned a while ago can have proper care and not be penalized for being old and without any money. So this story does reveal who Jesus is, and it reveals his function. It reveals that he has been sent by God. It could reveal that he is God, if that's what you want to believe. And that's what we've been taught to believe. But it emphasizes his function. He's been charged to take care of the world. And just as he has that function, he says to his disciples, to those who follow him, that is now your mission. That is now your function. To take up the cross and follow me wherever I go. And where does Jesus go? He always goes to the most vulnerable, to those people who are in need. And he trusts God along the journey. So we see that his function is to feed the hungry and rescue the perishing and heal the sick. And it's the same function that the church has today. And if you're doing anything other than that, you're failing. You don't even have little faith. You have no faith. Faith in a building is nothing. Faith in a culture of, well, I go to church on Sunday and I put money in the offering plate just to take care of my little club here. That has nothing to do with Jesus. So we see that faith isn't walking on water. Only God can walk on water. Faith is continuing on the journey despite the odds against us, believing that Jesus is with us along the way. May you go with peace, the peace of Christ.